Okay, we are live. This is being recorded. Welcome, host Harchaya and Avram and Harlan and those, and hopefully David and Colette will be listening to this later, and Yishai. So, just to give an overview of what where we're up to. I think we missed the last 2 or 3 weeks. We had to skip, but we are in the middle of chapter 2 of Seder Birchas Hanenin, second chapter, which is a very detailed halachic description of which types of breads are mizonos and which ones are hamoitzi, right? Generally, we know that we have any of the 5 grains that are mixed with water and they become dough and they are baked. They are either hamoitzi or they are mizonos. So in this chapter, in chapter 2, it goes into great detail describing the different methods of baking, the different methods of different types of dough, the different type of batters, how thick it is, how liquidy it is, based on that, whether it is a mezainis or hamoitzi. And we also threw in the difference between how much of it you eat. And if you remember, the breakdown generally was there are certain foods, certain pastries that are in the category of hamoitzi, which means even if you eat a crumb, you make a hamoitzi. That's like the regular bread. Then there is, on the other end of the spectrum, there are certain types of pastries which are mezoinos gum, where they're completely mezoinos, which means no matter how much of it I eat, I always make a mezoinos. Examples for that were things that were actually deep fried or cooked. Those things are mezoinos. Whether it's a knedel, you have a what's it called? In your soup, what do you put in your soup? Matzo ball soup, something like that. Or if you have donuts or things like cake, very sweet cakes like a brownie cake or a honey cake, where you have more of the sweets, of the honey, of the sugar, even more than the flour. So those are mezainis gomor. Things like that, no matter how much of it you eat, you make a mezainis. But then there is a large middle category. And people are not always so knowledgeable, and they don't always recognize, they're not always aware of how large this middle category is. Foods that we call lechem she'einai gomor. It is bread, but it isn't complete bread halachically, which means that these are breads, these are pastries, these are foods that we make a mezainos on it. However, if we eat more than 4 beitzim, which was around whatever it was, 8 ounces or so, then you have to make a hamoitzi, either a hamoitzi on itself or a hamoitzi on other bread, but we can't make a mezainos on it, right? And we said there are various opinions of what are these breads. Late night treat. Various opinions of what exactly are these these breads. So we basically brought a few examples. One opinion is if it's bread that has more of other liquids, more than the water. So whether it's fruit juice, whether it's eggs, or whether it is milk or anything else, oil that is more than the water, is 51% other liquids than water, then that would be a mezainos, according to one opinion. Another opinion is that if it's regular dough, but it is filled with something very sweet. So if it's filled with chocolate or sugar or cinnamon or even fruit or things like that, it's meant to be a dessert, it's meant to be a pastry, something sweet, not regular bread. So those things would be a mezainos. There are another opinion whether it is the batter is a very thin batter and it is baked that way. So different opinions exactly what it is, but these are basically certain things which are considered lechem she'einai gomor. You make a mezainos unless you eat a lot of it. Today, we're going to give a general overview on the second half of chapter 2. We have to talk about 2 things. We have to talk about what happens if we eat these foods, if we eat mezainos during a meal? What bracha do you make on it? And then we'll also touch upon a little bit about what happens if I bake after, if I bake mezainos that was cooked, or if I cook mezainos that was baked, does it change the status? So let's start with eating mezainos during a meal. Okay, so I have a meal, and during the meal we serve cake, we serve cookies, we serve mezainos bread, right? Which is bread that's made out of juice, fruit juice. I wash on a slice of bread, and now they're serving pizza that's made out of fruit juice. So what bracha do I make on it? Do I make a mezainos? Do I make a hamaitzi, or do I not make any bracha and it's part of the hamaitzi? Or what happens if also the other question is, what is the after blessing? If I do make a mezainos, do I also say the shorter al hamichya, which I say after mezainos, or do I say, you know what, it's just part of the long benching? What do I do? So the Alter Rebbe in Halacha 10 deals with this, and it is it's written a little bit out of, it's a little hard to understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying, but to break it down is as follows. Let's start with the end and we'll go back to the beginning. In regards to an after blessing, we don't make any special after blessing for any foods that are eaten during the meal. So if I have a dessert, if I have part of the meal, which is mezainos, we always make the regular benching. We don't do a special alamichya for food that was eaten during the meal. Question is, what is the bracha that we make before eating it? Okay, so anytime these foods, whether it is lechem she'eina gomer type of food, which means bread that has fruit juice, whether it is like a rugala or something like that, that's regular dough, but it's filled with chocolate, filled with sweets, which is a lechem she'eina gomer, or whether it is mezainos gomer, which means it's a cake, it's a brownie, it's a donut, which is mezainos gomer. If it is brought during the meal, not as a sweet, not as a pastry, not as a dessert, but it is brought as part of the food of the meal. It's meant to satiate ourselves off it. It's not being served as a dessert. It's not being served as an appetizer. It's being served as the main dish of the meal. So, for example, it is, if the bread that we're serving at the meal, I had a piece of, hamaitzi bread, but the rest of the bread is mezainos bread. It's not here as a dessert. It's not here as a treat. It's here as this is the bread of the meal. This is what we're eating. Then we don't make a separate bracha on it. It is, it gets covered by my bracha hamaitzi. And the same is true even with mezainos gomer. If for whatever reason there's a certain dish that has something which is mezainos gomer, if it has a donut, but it's not a donut that's a sweet donut necessarily, it's just a donut that we're eating part of the meal. Something that was fried, deep fried, and we're eating it as part of the meal. If it's not here as a dessert, we don't make a separate bracha on it. The only time that we perhaps make a separate bracha, mezainos, is only if something was brought to the table as a dessert, as an appetizer, as something sweet, as a pastry, right? As something in addition to the regular meal. Dessert, right? Now, not every time something that is mezainos is brought out as a dessert do we make a mezainos on it. And it gets a little bit tricky. And it's tricky, and that's why there are some people who always stay away from eating mezainos dessert before benching. Growing up, my father never wanted my mother to serve any dessert that is mezoinos during the meal before benching. He would always say, let's bench first, and then we'll have dessert. For this reason, because it gets a little bit complicated to know which mezoinos pastries, which mezoinos desserts do we make a hamoitzi on, and which one, I'm sorry, which is, do we not make a bracha on, which is covered by the hamoitzi of the meal, and which ones do we have to make a separate mezoinos on? And what does the Alter Rebbe say? The Alter Rebbe basically says in Halacha Yud that any time that there is an opinion that says that this may be hamoitzi, then even if we follow the opinion that it is mezoinos, however, when it's brought during the meal, we don't make a bracha. So, for example, the example brought is the first opinion. If you remember, we spoke about what exactly is one of the categories of foods that are lechem she'enoi gam, or they are incomplete bread, which means you make a mezoinos on it. Pas above kisnin, according to the first opinion, it is bread that is used 51% of the liquid is not water, right? Fruit juice is the most common. Fruit juice, eggs, or anything like that. That makes up the 51% of the liquid, right? Even though generally this is the opinion that we follow, and it is considered mezoinos. However, there is an opinion that says that no, this is still considered hamoitzi, right? So even though we follow the opinion that is mezoinos, if I eat this type of bread, but I'm not eating it as the meal, I'm eating it as a dessert, then I would not make another bracha during the meal. Okay? Only foods that have no other opinions that it is a so for example, this is probably most desserts probably fall into this category. If it is food that is the second opinion of pasta baba kistin, where it's filled with sweets, right? So something that's filled with sweets is the second opinion of pasta baba kistin, and because there isn't really another opinion that says that this would be hamoitzi, so that types of food we would make a mezoinos if it is brought. So like being more practical, an example of that would be, like we said, a ragala or other types of cakes that have like a crust of mezoinos, but the whole filling, like a pie or something like that, the whole filling is really what you're eating. You're not really eating the crust. So even though technically it's a mezoinos, but it's really the filling that you're eating. So these types of mezoinos desserts would require you to make a mezoinos even during the meal. And of course, anything that is mezoinos gomor, like sponge cake or brownies or things like that, for sure, those things are completely mezoinos. So for sure, those you would also have to make a mezoinos during the meal. The only things that you wouldn't is certain types of mezoinos that it is a dispute in halacha whether they are mezoinos or hamoitzi. So even though we follow the opinion that is mezoinos, but if you're eating it during the meal, we would not make a separate bracha on it. Does that make sense? Okay. To go to the second half of the second half of chapter 2 goes into great detail of what happens if you take something that it is either mezoinos or hamoitzi, and then now if it was cooked, now I'm baking it, or if it was baked, now I'm cooking it. Does it change the status? Does it change the status? So I'm not going to go into all the details because it's very detailed and a lot of different opinions, a lot of different scenarios. However, just the general idea. The general idea is that if I take something that is cooked, which I mean, bread that's cooked like a donut that's deep fried, or anything that's something that is made with a lot of liquid. Mezainas gamur, like matzah ball, knedel, as we say, right? And which is cooked in the soup. And now I bake it. Bake it means I bake it without any liquid. It's dry. Then it becomes like regular bread. So now I would have to make hamoitzi on it. It changes the bracha. But vice versa doesn't always work that way. Which means if I take something which is bread, was baked, and now I deep fry it, just deep frying itself does not make it mezainos. The only way it becomes mezainos is if the form changes. The only way it becomes mezainos is if it really falls into small pieces, smaller than a kazayas. So the typical example of that will be matzah ball soup. Matzah ball, right? What's a matzah ball? You took a matzah, but you didn't just put the matzah in the water and you boiled the matzah. You actually grinded the matzah. So now when you grind the matzah and you cook it, now the matzah it changes its status. It's not hamoitzi anymore. And now it will become mezainos. So that's why matzah balls, even though they were originally matzah, because they were ground, obviously less than a kazayas each piece, and now they're cooked, now they're boiled, so they would have the halacha of now.
That's only less than
now you're putting them together, right? Either now you're putting them together, and now it's like one piece. However, it's still considered a mezainos. But it's important to realize that this is only because it's ground, which means that if you take regular matzahs and you basically like just break it up into your soup, those pieces of matzah will still be considered hamoitzi. And even has considered hamoitzi. Now, another area just to let's give me 1 second. Another area that some people ask is what's the halacha in regards to croutons? Mm-hmm. Right? You buy croutons for a soup, so you can buy some croutons that are made as croutons. They're like they're probably like boiled or steamed, whatever. So they're not hamoitzi. But you can buy bread croutons, right? What are these bread croutons? Seemingly, they are croutons that are pieces of bread, and then they're cut into pieces. They're cut into size. So here, even though each size is less than the kazayas, perhaps, but because it's piece of bread, it's a small piece of bread. It hasn't changed its form. It hasn't been, boiled as it's just seemingly it's just bread that's cut up to size. So many croutons are actually hamoitzi. So you have to be aware of this, that when you're having croutons in your salad, it might be hamoitzi croutons, and you might have to wash in order to eat those croutons. Now, many croutons are made different ways. Some of them are fried afterwards, or some of them are cooked afterwards. I'm not going into all the details now. In the second half, you read it inside Halacha 13, 14, 15, and then it goes into great detail every scenario of what different types of bread. You read it inside and to apply it to the different types of foods that we know about. But this is the general idea of the second half of chapter 2 in regards to these halachas. I'm going to end over here. It's a little bit of a shorter class. As you see, we have a special guest over here. I just wanted to conclude, because we missed a few weeks. I want to just conclude this topic of mezainos, and then next time we learn, we're going to learn about in greater details what happens when there's a mixture, when you have one food that has two different brachos in it, right? So you have, let's say, a crust and you have a pie, or if you have a hadama and a ha'etz fruit mixed together, you have a fruit salad or something like that, right? We have as a cereal and milk, right? You're eating two foods that have two different brachas and eating them together. So what bracha do you make in it? We'll discuss that next week. I'll conclude over here, and yeah, it's a little of a shorter class, but I just wanted to conclude that I didn't want to wait till next week to finish this topic.